everyone. I welcome you to the first edition of Delhi NCR webinar series, Karma Down the Memory Lane. I like to welcome the chief guest, Mr. Rahul Razvan from the first batch of class of 2002. Just to quickly introduce himself, he has over nearly 2+ decades of experience, ranging across media in different kinds of media, whether it's television, documentary films, interactive media, internet, social media, online gaming, etc. He has also been the chairman of Wiki Gaming Forum. Currently, he is the CEO of Reliance Jio, the chat vertical. Prior to that, he was the ex-CEO of Tencent. Setting up the WeChat, and then he was also the ex-president of Ibibo in India. He comes with the design and the UX design etc. Experience, and over the next 1 hour, he'll be sharing his experience the topic that we have had. And then I also welcome my team members. Gargi, Yash, Vidit, who's part of the Delhi NCR team. Together, we'll be walking you through the next 1.5 hour session. Yeah, over to you, sir.
Hey, thank you so much, Vikash, and good afternoon to the entire IIM Indore alumni family. Couple of things I just wanted to add. First, I cannot ever get tired of repeating the fact that I'm from the first batch. I've done various things in my career on the corporate, professional, personal side, and that includes a lot of startups. But the best startup that I have ever worked or been a part of has been the setting up of IIM Indore, and for that I have a certain connect. And every time I go to the campus, this is a thread that I keep picking up. As I mentioned to people, also it's also a relationship that keeps giving. I mean, it's almost like a compounding relationship. It just keeps giving more and more as we go along. And a lot of what you guys have been doing over the last, nearly 20 years now, I think that has contributed to my return on investment from my and I speak for my entire batch as well. What we've been getting from IIM Indore is in a big measure also got to do with what the subsequent batches have been doing. So I mean, I just wanted to always start my sessions with that. Before we start, I'll also a couple of disclaimers, a couple of caveats. First, so this is the first webinar for me. I know right now there are a lot of memes and a lot of jokes around, one more webinar, and there's a Batman who's slapping a person who suggests one more webinar. All marketing companies, everybody's doing a webinar these days. So there is a certain amount of diffidence on one side and fatigue on the other side. But I think the only one that I would have agreed to would be, doing this with the IIM Indore community. And therefore, just bear with me if it's a different experience for me to be talking into a device where I do not know who all is on the other side. Normally in a conference, you get to see everybody in, slotted boxes and windows, but out here, I do not see anybody. So I trust you guys are there and listening to me. Okay. So when the team, the organizing team was talking to me about what is it, that I could share with you today, there were a few topics that were discussed. The two that we finally shortlisted was one, my journey through the years, and it is a very interesting, exciting journey. It has got a lot of unexpected turns and a lot of twists, and there are ups and downs. There are roller coaster moments, and there are cruise moments. And I said, what, I like the journey so much that as much as I would love to share it with the IIM Indore community, I would also want to hold it back for my autobiography, which I'll be writing someday maybe. So what I picked up was the next best topic that is really close to my heart. That is about making products and experiences in what I today call the humane way. This entire thought has a history. That history stems across multiple disciplines, and I think it's reached a certain point, and especially the happenings in the world over the last couple of months, it has brought in sharp focus. How should we look at products and services, and hope to make them more relevant and useful for the people. So okay, so this was just the prelude, the introduction, the primer. So I wanted to share with you I did my graduation in architecture. So I'm a Bachelor's of Architecture from School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, SPA. A 5-year education which completely changes your worldview. So a lot of people, we get into graduation and, we kind of go through the motions. And then we're looking for an MBA, the kinds that, IIM Indore offers, to then, kind of launch us onto the next level or kind of shape us in a certain manner. I know some of you come from the IPM, stream also, which is a slightly, entirely evolutionary kind of a, educational structure that has come up. But for people like me, architecture was one such education which completely transforms you over a 5-year period. Normal graduation of 3. I mean, so many of us are engineers, and 4 years is what engineers do. Yes, doctors, their MBBS plus internship plus house job and all is longer. But by way of formal education, architecture, those 5 years completely transforms you, and that happened to me as well. So one of the things in architecture, and there's a constant debate that kept happening in the years that we were studying architecture, and eventually when people go on to practicing architecture, there is a phrase called form follows function. So this, and how this phrase started also, there are debates about who said it and all. So somewhere, Wikipedia seems to suggest that, Louis Sullivan, the architect, he was the one who kind of coined this term, form follows function. So the way this can be interpreted is that eventually it's what a form, a structure, the structure could be an external structure, could be a product. What it does is, what it should look like, or the way it is shaped, should actually be based on what functional utility is going to serve. And there's a school of thought continues to grow and thrive, which believes that form should always follow function. And then there was a counter school of thought which believes that it doesn't matter, form also has to delight. Sometimes you have to surprise people. Everything cannot be about utility. Some there are human experiences which are larger than just utility, and forms, product or space forms need, or even process forms need to address those. So there are these two schools of thought, and the debate, I got into the debate in the early 90s. We are into 2020. The debate continues. I'm sure it's going to continue till humanity is there. Form follows function. Remember that. But one interesting thing that I learned during that period was that form follows function was further evolved into another phrase which was put into form follows purpose. So this, as an architecture student learning, a discipline which is entirely new, is changing you, and you can feel the change that is happening in you. So this entire evolution of form follows function to form follows purpose opens, broadens the scope of this. Purpose could mean anything. Form follows purpose. Whose purpose? The user's purpose. The purpose of the person who is using an object, a phone, a car, a chair, a house, filling up a web form, using an app, cooking something, marking out traffic paths in a supermarket. So what is the bigger purpose that the user is serving? So that the user may be buying a phone, he may be using a phone, but his utility is he's using a phone, his purpose may be different. And when you try to tackle it at the, following the purpose that the user has, you may be able to have a slightly different connect or slightly different understanding of what drives the user. So I'm just kind of starting up with some bit of theory on this one, but it's good to, maybe not subscribe to any one of these views, but it's good to be aware of these and arrive at your own, balance of where it, how you are going to internalize that as part of your, practice of catering to users. So this was one, form follows function, or form follows function stroke purpose. The other approach that I found a lot more when, I started making web applications and, website pages, etc., was the view of the world as a product-centric view versus the view of the world as a user-centric view. In software design, this kind of, I think the equation kind of got established firmly in favor of user-centric design. And what it means is when you make a product, process, space, flow, workflow, a lot of times it is not about you having made the product or you having made the or solved a certain technological problem to arrive at a solution. At some point, you have to keep the user at the center of what you're going to do. It cannot be about, hey, I made such a nice app with 25 features, or I made an app with, the ability to change these 1,000 colors or these 1,000 themes. If you do not understand how users are going to react to those themes or those colors, so you have to somewhere keep the user in mind a lot more. So this is the other. I mean, just wanted to how from the world of architecture, physical architecture, where it was about form follows function, to in the software world, a lot of it is about the designs and processes should be user centric and not necessarily product centric. So this is just wanted to set the context. Now, wherever I am right now, it's an interesting journey. I'll keep it for the autobiography, but I just take you through somebody. So I start after having finished architecture. We did some bit of freelance work between some of us worked with on exciting small projects that friends and all would give us. But I was fortunate enough to work for a faculty member of ours, Mr. Anil Law. He passed away a couple of years back. Now he was actually one of those teachers who should rattle you up in terms of your thinking, and what emerges out of that is an entirely different person. So he not only was a very successful teacher, he had also he was also an architectural entrepreneur. He was also an inventor. He was also a media person. So what he done was he started making a lot of these low cost, alternative and sustainable methodologies of construction. So he would make these new construction techniques, and then these would be dissipated to various parts of the world, whether to architectural institutes, whether to municipalities or thought leaders, and these were made as documentary. Then these were kind of passed on to them as documentary films. So I was making documentary films on architecture, with Mr. Lal, and we did that. I did that for a few years. And started doing a lot of, the internet was happening around that time. This was mid-90s, so got completely blown over. I mean, the first time I saw how the internet works on a friend's computer, I knew this is where I wanted to be. And somehow I think I've been lucky enough. Whatever I've done since then has actually always been on the within the overall universe of the internet. Now, of course, it changes form, it changes medium of delivery, the platforms are different, but it's still the internet. And then I happened to do go into IIM Indore, 2 years. Again, while I mentioned how architecture changed and formed a certain amount of worldview for me, IIM Indore was very interesting for somebody like me coming from architecture. The subjects, the approach to certain disciplines was completely alien to me. I mean, I'd never seen a balance sheet. I did not. We are not taught anything in economics, anything in accounts, finance. Yes, there is some bit of building economics, but that is more about estimation and costing of building projects, but not the way finance was taught. And I was sitting with youngsters who were toppers in Delhi University in economics, and they'd been doing it since high school, and they were so comfortable with the subject. And here's somebody like me who's practically learning it from scratch. But the interesting thing about IIM Indore was that our founding faculty was, I think we're extremely lucky to have founding faculty like that. I would take a couple of names. I think our founding PGP chairperson was Professor Shaugatare. He had just finished his fellowship program at IIM Ahmedabad, and I give credit to the entire the leadership and management of IIM Indore to have asked a gentleman like him to be the founding PGP chairman, PGP chairperson. He was, I mean, he would have been like 28, 29, 30 max. I would have been like 27, 28. I mean, so we are like similar ages. He was an idealist. He was a hard taskmaster. He was a believer in things. And yet he would tell you to kind of break, processes. He would tell you to, get onto new ways of thinking, appreciate something that has been taught to you in a structured format, internalize it, and come up with something which then you own as a thought. And so he was the one who kind of changed us a lot. And he used to work so hard. Remember, we were the first batch. We were working in a makeshift building. We had leased it out from a women's polytechnic in Rajendra Nagar in Indore. Those of you, who happen to have gone for a tour once in a while. So the faculty had the responsibility of setting up the institution, looking at people like, a fresh batch for the first time. There are certain processes to be followed. There are new grounds to be broken. And then there are people like me who in a certain world, we are misfits into this, a PGP program. So he kind of, and then there was Professor Ganesh was there. I remember Professor Khokle was there. There was Professor Nitin Gupta. There was Professor Amit Gupta. And these are all, and then I'll forget, there was Professor Jay Kumar. And these were all people who, I don't know, they were kind of, they were synchronized so well that they drilled into people that we at that point, honestly, we used to joke about it. They said, you are here for the learning and not for the grades. So all of you have been through that process where, there are grades and there are quizzes and then there are, tests and then there are assignments, case studies. And at the end of it, what seems to matter in the moment is what grades you're getting. But I think we are very lucky in that sense. The faculty really understood and they kind of instilled it back into us that don't worry about learning. Don't worry about the grades, worry only about the learning. Now, that was very interesting. For somebody like me, how I saw my progress was from where I started. Now, I did not have to necessarily compare myself with how my peers, an extremely bright set of people, and how they were reacting to an issue we discussed in class, because they had to benchmark their learning based on what they knew. My learning was benchmarked on where I came from. So I think that was a hugely comforting environment. So 2 years in IIM Indore, and then Sony Entertainment came they came to campus. Again, year 2000, the first batch passing out. First time the industry is getting a look into what IIM Indore has been doing, with its students and its methodologies, and what are the kind of students who the industry could look forward to getting from IIM Indore. And we were a very small batch of around 35, 36 odd. So Sony Entertainment Television, we were thankful that companies were coming, and Sony Entertainment Television came. They were looking for people in conventional roles of there was marketing, sales, and I think and mostly in marketing, sales. That's what they would look for an MBA. So in my interview, I requested the gentleman saying that I am not interested in either, but if you have something around this overlap between media and technology, and I would share my internet experience and my experience in the internet domain, I would be very keen to join. And they were nice enough. They kind of on the spot created a bit of a job profile. I joined them, spent a couple of years in Mumbai. Again, great times, and those were good days for the media industry. There's a lot that one learned. After 2 years, I came to Delhi to join this educational institute called School of Convergence, and it was a newly established media school. And so I was very keen. I thought I knew everything about media, and I wanted to pass it on to people. So this institute was it was a JV between a couple of media groups and a management institute in Delhi. So I spent about 2.5, 3 years out there. Again, that's been another great experience for me, where today, every time I'm consuming some media, whether it's print, television, cinema, radio, a lot of times my gratification comes from seeing, the credits of folks who I've taught, folks who are my students, seeing their names somewhere. So this is, so once a movie ends, a lot of people start walking out. I actually hang back, just look at the credits and, oh, that guy's my student, that girl, of course, we taught her also. So it's another one of those, experiences that keeps giving back to you. So a couple of years of doing that, I figured out my challenge was that a lot of what I was sharing by way of education, the education at that point in time was anecdotal, was based on my experiences, things that I had seen. At that point in time, I did not realize, or maybe the circumstances weren't such that one could institutionalize that, or turn it into an academic curriculum, and so that it could be perpetuated, so that by the time second or third year of teaching the same course, I did not feel, why am I repeating this? This is not even relevant today. This is something that was relevant 3 years back. So I take a part of that, was part of my learning there. I felt it was all anecdotal, so I think I need to go back to the industry. Then I joined Satyam Computers for a couple of, for less than 2 years. But Satyam also was an interesting experience. I was working with this, the way this corporate structure, there were functional specialization, there were technology specializations, then there were horizontal functions. One of them was called user experience management. Now you'll see a thread in why whatever I say. I worked with them, but the point was that most of the folks working in a company like Satyam were engineers who were doing technology, software deployments across various corporates, across various verticals, in various industries. And people like me had the job of talking to CXOs and telling them, you know what, we've also got a great UX solution, user experience management, solution that could sit on top of this technology stack, which would enhance the, your return from the software solutions that you are investing in right now. And CXO levels understood it very well. So normally my job was to, convince CXOs about this, this kind of competence that we had. And while I was there, I happened to just read about the fact that the Naspers group of South Africa was setting up operations in India. I'd never heard about them, and I also heard they'd hired a gentleman called Ashish Kashyap as their CEO. I had never heard about Ashish Kashyap, but the news somehow I know it kind of triggered something in me. I reached out to a few friends who I thought would have known Ashish. Some of them made an introduction. I was in Delhi on a project on a lunch break. I went to meet Ashish. Over a half an hour to 40-minute discussion, I decided I want to work with him, and that eventually went on to become the IBIBO group. And so I was a part of the founding team. Just a couple of, maybe half a dozen or so of us who started IBIBO, and that went through a variety of evolutionary paths. It kind of completely evolved at a very rapid pace. We learned, unlearned, built stuff, demolished stuff, challenged ourselves into looking at what we're doing. Is it working for the audience? So there's a lot of learning that was coming, but the key learning was what I discussed as the primer, that everything that you do has to be user-centric. It has to talk to users. It has to be doing something to the users for it to be relevant. So IBIBO, I spent quite a long time, and then Tencent was coming to India with launching their global product called WeChat. WeChat continues to be the a product or a product ecosystem that is written about very in a very curious manner by the world media in terms of what is it that they've been able to crack in China that the rest of the world can learn from. So we launched WeChat India. That's something that I did along with my team. And then I just forgot to mention IBIBO. Of the various things that we did, the thing that I founded and took to maximum scale was gaming. So gaming had kind of touched a chord in me. I think I was loving gaming a lot. So once WeChat happened, we launched WeChat, but I was still very keen to get onto gaming. And then there was an opportunity to work in a gaming startup, launch it, take them off. Like with a lot of startups, we kind of the runway kind of ended before we could have anything substantial out. But again, lots of learnings there. Then Jio happened, and Jio also was very interesting. I'll some details I'll spare you, but of the years that I was working at IBIBO with games, there was a certain approach that I found amongst the erstwhile telcos. And there was a vision that we had for the telcos of the world where everything has to be about data. It cannot be about managed services, telco services. There's a certain way that telcos work. So the point was, why would the world not shift to everything is going to the internet? It may be on the mobile, but everything is going to be internet. So why would telcos not get onto that bandwagon? And I was thinking about it the early parts of 2010s and all. So Jio just happened, and when I joined Jio, I figured this is pure happenstance. This is just circumstances leading you into a place where what you had been imagining the future of connectivity and telcos to be, Jio actually had that blueprint, and Jio's about to launch, and Jio is about to do that. And then of course Jio launched, and you've seen how the entire Indian digital the digital world has completely transformed. I mean, and I said thanks entirely to how Jio has, managed to touch everybody, how Jio has managed to impact it. And so there are things that I've done at Jio, especially related to messaging. We launched a product called JioChat. Then we did some things for enterprises. We kind of then we've then created software components that actually fit as parts into a bigger jigsaw, playing a very crucial role and all. So there are things that we've been doing. It's again been a great learning, continues to be a great learning experience. So that's broadly about me. Now, since I started with the primer of a couple of points about form follows function, product centric versus user centric, I'll also leave you with two more thoughts. Again, these are slightly crystallized thoughts. So one was about, and this is something that you may get to hear a lot more across the various functional disciplines that you would be handling. It's about the user's journey from a product journey or a service journey from solving user pain. So user has a pain and you solve that pain. At the other end of the spectrum is user delight. And it's about where you pitch your product, service, flow, or whatever you're making. From solving a pain to user delight situation, you got to figure out at what stage are you doing to users. So it's important to know your place. Then last point that I leave you with is this, that in gaming, there's an insight that we picked up while we started making games, was that of the various things that the internet does for people, and maybe in our discussion subsequently, we will also touch upon that. How what do people use the internet for? So there were multiple reasons why people do that. Hey, I see Altamash. Hi, Altamash. So Altamash, I met him whenever I would go to Sony, because while I was the first guy to join Sony, I think he would be one of the most recent guys to have joined Sony. I don't know where he is. I hope you're doing well. We'll come back to the discussion, Altamash. The various things the internet does, some of the common things about people are lonely, people want to make money, people want to get famous, people want to, meet their life partner or whatever, whatever the preferences, people. So there are this bunch of 7, 8, user motivations. The one that struck us the most, and then as I mentioned, this is during the IBBO games time, was enhance users' self-esteem. Now, this we took to heart and we are very serious about it. And I'll give you examples. So we had, amongst games, we had many kinds of, game genres and game varieties that we had. And we figured out there's no one size fits all, because the user is not, it's not the same user. There are different people with different motivation. I'll give you an example. So some of you, and in fact, some of you would be, in fact, yeah, because this includes older alumni also. Early days of computers, you just had these 2 or 3 games in your Windows PC. You would play Minesweeper, Solitaire, Free Cell, and you would keep on playing them for hours at end. And your challenge was to beat yourself. So every time you do better than how you did previously, it would take your self-esteem a notch higher. So you would play games to feel better about yourselves than you felt before you started the game. First. Second, this early 2010s and early 2012 till about 2013, 14 was the era of social games. In social games, the point was, while it's okay for me to play against an algorithm and feel better about myself, what if I play a game against my friends who are on any of the social networks, and then feel very happy about the fact that, hey, you know what, I have defeated my so-and-so friend, and you know what, amongst all my friends, I am on top of, or even if I'm not on top, at least I defeated that friend of mine, and then I get riveted. Hey, I'm at least doing better than you. So now my self-esteem has another, benchmark, which is my social graph, my friends. Now, if I'm doing better than them in a game, it again enhances my self-esteem. The third was when you play against people in general, and you do very well, and the score gets registered on a leaderboard. Now, a leaderboard is a record of people who scored high scores in a descending order. The highest, or descending, ascending, whatever is the scoring methodology. But the top guys on top, and then the kind of goes down. So for some people, the kick is on being on the leaderboard, being on top of the leaderboard, or at least making it to the leaderboard. So there was a global leaderboard. Who is the highest scorer ever? Now, the challenge is the best guys who happen to make it to the top of the leaderboard tend to remain there. And that acts as a demotivator to others who come in. Oh my God, this guy's already racked up 1,000,000 points. I'm just starting. There's no way I'm going to make it. I don't want to play this game. At least from the prism of this motivation. So we then, the game designers, they started having leaderboards cut across. The best score in the last 30 days, the best score in the last week, last 24 hours. So at every point, there was an opportunity for a new guy also to register, or get registered on the leaderboard. So this was another user motivation. It makes you feel good about yourself. Then, of course, we've come to the era of live multiplayer gaming, and so many of you would have played PUBG and Fortnite and other games. The point, these are in a way combined 2-3 of the matrices. You are playing, you are beating your previous scores, you are trying to feel happy about yourselves, but you're thrown into an environment where it's life or death virtually. And again, there are people who love that, to be in that situation. And the moment they are able to successfully or unsuccessfully navigate out of it, there is a certain change of their own perception of how they see themselves. So again, it's about how it impacts their self-esteem. So this is the last one. I believe it's a deep insight where, while we picked it up and we used it a lot in gaming, I believe this is something that cuts across all product categories, all product things, all product solutions, processes, workflows, whatever you're making or whatever you're in the process of making. See if this is one of those user motivations that you can tap into. So this is broadly that what I wanted to share by way of the setting the discussion going. Couple of examples more, but these are not theoretical examples. These are pure life examples of how there are some product processes which are more empathetic to users. And I'm using empathy as a bigger word. Something may seem very trivial, but at some point, some product decisions are actually highly empathetic. So I'll give you examples, and some of them I've seen come across very, very recently. So some I'll share. One is, if you've sat in a flight, of course not right now, but whenever we did, and you get those, when the tea or coffee comes and you open the creamer or you open that milk pouch or sugar. So good companies create that small triangular notch at the corner. Or if you're using any one of the other pouches, small pouches of any product, good companies already create that notch. So every time you just kind of, move your finger, it just shears across and you're able to, you don't have to struggle with, cutting it with your teeth or looking for scissors, because you're not going to go get those. That notch, whosoever made or whosoever thought of first as packaging, was a great example of empathetic product design. If you get one of those small packets of achar or butter, you see the corner has been flipped over a little, so that when you pick up the hold from the corner and you are able to completely open the peel of that packaging, that flipped corner is empathetic product design. Extremely important. You may think, there's a certain production process where there's a lot goes into machines, molds, acquiring materials, packaging, pricing, all your 4 Ps and all. That notch makes a huge difference. Then 2-3 examples I wanted to pick up from. This all happened in the recent Corona COVID-19 news or things that one gets to hear. One was about so there's this news. What I tweeted about it, I think the team, the organizing team, kind of picked up on that as well. So there was this news where people who've gone into who've contracted the disease and they're being treated, the doctors who treat them are wearing these PPE masks, and there are multiple layers, and there's a there are 2 or 3 coverings of the face, and then what the patient is seeing, he's afflicted. It's a new disease. You do not know what's in store, so a person is completely clueless. The circumstance in which you are diagnosed and you are put into treatment is completely new for the world. You do not know. You've just been shunted from one to the other. Now you're sitting here, and this bunch of 4 doctors come and stand in front of you. It's one of the most intimidating sights. Here, doctors who are trying to help you, they mean well, but their clothing makes it appear like you think that you are an alien, or you are in some kind of deep trouble. And who are these guys? So what somebody thought of was, they actually pinned photographs of these doctors in smiling poses, and they kind of stuck them to the uniforms of these doctors. So the doctors are all covered up, and then their photos have been taped up. So when the patient is looking at these doctors, and he sees happy, smiling faces. He knows there are, warm human beings behind these. And again, this is a positive trigger towards even the eventual treatment path. So, and again, I said this is this is one of the highest, rated examples of empathetic design. Nothing. There is no invention. There is nobody need to crack anything. No, this is not a vaccine. This is not a, this is not something that involves, multiple teams working on some solution. And, this is a pure and simple understanding of users' mindsets and having empathy to address that. So this was the, next one. One minor one. I'm sorry, some message came. The message just come and pass. So I'm about to finish. So we'll just take the messages right after the comments right after this. Last one was, so you've seen the stories about how the N95 masks, etc. They are so tight, and so at some point they kind of people tend to leave marks, or the people tend to bleed because of these. And when you put them around your ears, the way it holds your ears, your ears are also stressed. So what somebody did was people design masks which kind of loop behind your ears, or which instead of looping behind your ears, actually go and attach themselves onto the cap or headgear that you're wearing. So they put notches on the headgear, and these masks would actually go and loop onto so the weight is being borne by the headgear and not by your ears. Very simple solution. Now, and I'm saying it doesn't take any, it's not a breakthrough. It's just understand empathetic solutioning for the users. In this case, the users will be the healthcare workers who normally have to put on these masks for a longer period of time. So broadly, this is, these are just 3-4 examples. And yeah, I just want to happy to get into, the discussions. So team, my great organizing team, over to you. By the way, I cannot read messages that come. They go very fast. This is a feedback for the Zoom team. If the messages are expected to be read by the speaker, they stay on the screen for a very short period of time. Or maybe I haven't done enough of these. Maybe it's a learned behavior. So anyway, over to the team, organizing team.
Gargi, would you like to take up the questions?
Yes, I'll start taking up the questions. Thank you, sir, for sharing your experiences with us. So the first question is by Shrishti Narayan. She asks, given the popularity or the network effect that WhatsApp has achieved in India, how does GeoChat plan to compete with it? She's talking about how are different products competition, how will it happen?
Great. Hey, hi Srishti. And this is something that I told the I told the team that we would avoid questions directly talk about issues I may not be able to share. But great, I think this question or this category of question needs to be answered. So I'll go back to the 5 years back when I had joined Jio. The question was valid then. The question has continued to have certain manner of validity. The fact that messaging is such an important part of the user's digital experience on phones, that even if you have an incumbent who is dominant, and you may think that because of different factors that work, including network effect, you should avoid getting into that. I think it's the exact opposite. The exact opposite is, because of the kind of impact we've seen, this product category has, it becomes imperative to figure out how we can crack it. So I'm saying there different people react to different things. For me, the challenge always about what is it that we can do, which solves the problem, which may be unsolved as of now. And just to kind of give you an example, and here's my favorite example, and I'm telling you one of these. This is those examples that somebody has to make a case study out of. So you're aware of Reliance Foundation. Reliance Foundation does a lot of social work at the grassroots across the country, across all parts of the country. And what I'm talking of has happened in the last few years. I'm not referring to anything happening in the last few months. So when the team would go out to meet farmers in the deep pockets of the countries, and they would organize camps for these farmers around what the problems they're facing. And they started using GeoChat as a tool. So there would be a team of doctors that they would organize. The doctor had GeoChat in front of him, and then the farmer was encouraged to have GeoChat, and he would, log in. He would kind of, get onto GeoChat and interact with the doctor. Now, what are the kind of interactions? So here are two examples. And for me, what I'm about to share is something that, I was completely blown over. So here's an example. So here is a guy who had cattle, some cows, and the cows had some problems around their udders. So they had to click a picture of what the problem was. So they took a selfie stick. Now imagine a selfie stick, and you got your phone put at the beginning of the selfie stick. You put that selfie stick under the cow's belly, click a picture of the udders, and send it across to the doctor. Now think about what selfie sticks are normally assumed to be useful for. They're supposed to be vanity tools. You'd use them in happy times and you're partying with your friends, or you're on a picnic or something like that. Use a selfie stick, everybody smiles, and you click a picture. Now look at this. Here's a farmer. He puts the selfie stick under the cow's belly, clicks a picture of the udders, and gets instant. The photo goes to the doctor, and the doctor advises, this seems to be a problem, this is the solution. Now GeoChat is incidental. Again, I'm saying it doesn't matter if it was GeoChat. It was about what he was doing with the selfie stick, which was a big eye opener for me, and huge learning opportunity. So we thought, maybe one-off incident. It turns out, a few weeks later, another kind of report comes in. So there are farmers who got, I'm forgetting whether it was ladyfinger or one of those crops, where the leaves had a problem, and there's some kind of some infection that kind of attaches itself, or fungus that attaches to the lower half of the leaves. Now you cannot see from the top, because when you're seeing from the top, these are all shrubs which are about a feet and a half tall. Now how do you click a picture of a leaf underneath of a leaf? Again, the same selfie stick comes out, and you put it under the plant of the leaf, click a picture, and lo and behold, you have a picture of the underside of a leaf. And these are standard case textbook problems which the doctor is able to address in a minute's time. So just want to share examples where some of the problems that you're solving are so relevant that somehow it really doesn't matter if you are not winning somebody else's battles. You are winning a lot of battles which are important to you, which are important to some people, and that's how we've seen our philosophy in terms of the kind of things we've done, and that's what we will continue to do.
Thank you, sir. We've got a lot of people who are asking you about your experience about introducing people to the internet.
Introducing people to the internet. Okay, this is super awesome. And I'll start from the reverse. The toughest has been going to dealing with the real elders in my family, extended family. What you're reading as memes currently on the, on social media and all. Today, the challenge is on getting a lot of these elders away from the internet, because what they read in by way of, fake news, false news, or news which is deliberately, put out with the intention of getting people to think and behave in a certain manner. So this is the biggest challenge. The easier challenges have been getting my dad to do a right click on a mouse. So my son, who's 7 years old, he has figured out a way. He holds a mouse with both hands, and he moves it on both hands, and he knows when to do the left click, when to do the right click. I never taught him, because he belongs to a generation where everything is click on an icon on a touch screen. Mouse handling was an experience that he learned on his own on the house desktop that we. My father, I figured I had to struggle a lot with getting him to look at the behavior. Now again, the guys who are, I think all of you get it. Even the purely born in a laptop generation will get it. Think about a PC screen. It's a screen in front of you. If your visual eye, your eye is actually looking into the screen. You have something called a mouse. It is on another plane, a dimensional, entirely different dimension, on a table. You hold it and you move it around on a table. It's on a different dimension. What this is doing is moving a cursor on a screen which is on a vertical dimension. Now, this is a learned behavior. Some of us took to it very easily, where moving your hand in the horizontal way is going to move something in the vertical dimension so that you can click, move your mouse on a screen. My father struggled. He would not get it at all. So if he had to do that, he had to look towards the mouse to see how he was moving. Then he was not looking at the screen. If he's looking at the screen, he doesn't know where the mouse is moving. So huge challenge. Then he understood it somehow. Then the challenge was getting him to do the right click. Because, that's how the devices are made. There's a left click and there's a right click. And at some point I gave up. And then there were more complicated, mice, I don't know whether mice is the right word, that were being made, which had a scroll wheel. In architecture, we had one which had 3 buttons. The middle button used to open up the context window if you're working on AutoCAD and any of the softwares. 3 buttons. I mean, these were getting to be intimidating devices. So yeah, this was one experience of getting people to start using the mouse. And then what else? Then the other one is the explanation of the internet was very easy. And I'll share with that moment when I mentioned there's a moment that I knew this was a place for me and I wanted to be in this was. So a friend explained to me. Again, this is something that a lot of you may not know. So in the early days, everything had to be a website. Internet meant the public internet being on a website. There were these server-based services, but to be using consumer internet, you had to be on the web. You had to use a browser. You had to be navigating through a website. And websites were all hosted on a server. So you had to understand there's something called a web page, which was made in a language called HTML. And then there was a way for these pages to be interlinked to each other. And absolute bare bones. And how you compose these pages with images, text, etc. And then you would save them. And then you had to upload all of them onto a server. And then somebody else sitting somewhere else would actually type in www.rahulrazdan.com and come to the same page that you had put out there. So the trick was when, at that point, I used to have Internet Explorer as the dominant browser. Netscape was the other one. So the friend showed me, you opened up an Internet Explorer web page, and there was this thing called view source. Now, view source is what, it kind of hits you like, that's it. So you see how it starts, the tagging starts at HTML, then goes on to something, what will happen in the header, what will happen in the body. And then you say, oh my God, now this is, those of you, of course, who come from coding backgrounds, I may be talking like a caveman, but this is what internet was in the early 90s, mid-90s, so not early 90s, mid-90s. And for me, that entire thing of how you change view source and you refreshed on the browser and the page had actually changed was the moment that I knew I had to be this. Then, of course, in the 3 years that I taught at the School of Convergence, one of the subjects was getting people to go through the same experience, but I would, teach them offline to make a web page, tell them to upload it. And then when they would tell their friend, "Maine the page banaya hai, you should download it," that was an aha moment for them. A lot of folks. And so this was the experience. Last anecdote on this one. I met up with a student of mine recently. He was my student at School of Convergence. Now he works with all these, big MNCs, and a part of his job is looking at risks of frauds. Where people make fraudulent claims about IPR, trademarks, and a lot of this is online. So he shared with me, said, "Sir, I remember, you had penalized me once in the class because while you were telling everybody to code the web pages, writing code in Notepad, a lot of us, were actually picking up one of these software like Dreamweaver, etc. And we were just making the page in that, saving and showing and pretending to you that we had written the code. And so you caught me, and others were also doing it. And I remember that. I think I would have caught a few of them. And he says, "Sir, look at the irony. Today I'm working in my corporate job today is all about preventing frauds. And I was caught in a small, of whatever nature fraud that you had caught me for." So, it was, nothing serious and all, but, how life takes you in certain directions. Sometimes you remember some of those tiny incidents as well. Yeah. So this is about, my experiences with teaching people getting onto the internet.
Okay, thank you, sir. As you mentioned a little bit about the fake news part, I would like to focus on that. That given the fact that right now we've got products where even Apple or Google, Twitter, everyone is trying to tell you, okay, you should reduce your time. This is the amount of time that you've been using this particular app. So how do you think that a company will be making profits off of it? Because they're trying to make sure that they give you that attention span also, but then they're also making sure that they can take care of your health, like the human aspect of it.
So these are great question. I think what you've done is, in my opinion, you actually mixed two problems which are not necessarily which do not stem from the same point. So what the device companies have a certain responsibility. So do software companies, which make such compelling software that you continue to swipe through your social network, looking at pictures, clicking pictures of it. Every time you have food, you have to click a picture of the food before you start eating it. And some of these behaviors become over time they tend to impact your normal human personality or how you would behave. So there are hardware companies who get into this entire concept of screen time, and again they're not it's not a hard stop, it's a soft stop. They recommend to your screen time has gone up or gone down, etc. Now it's up to you. You may completely ignore it, and I'm sure people do. I mean, even when we are in a deep heavy work kind of a workflow where it's a 4-hour activity, and after every 1 hour the thing is telling me, oh, you need to take a break, I have to ignore it with a bit of a smirk, saying that I know myself better. So they have a certain responsibility to remind you. I think that's good. It's for people to take that reminder. That's also good. So then there is the other concept of fake news. So I think from the platforms, I think it's happening. I still believe it's a question of what's the definition of what's harmful. At what point does it start affecting you? Should that judgment be left to people? Should there be some global guidelines in which people can adjust themselves in terms of figuring out, I can take this, I cannot. I'll take a small example, maybe completely irrelevant, but smoking, for example. I mean, if you see the two ends of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum says smoking is the worst thing that could have happened to humanity. There are people in our group who smoke, and and I'm saying somewhere we figure out where do we want to be by way of taking part in it, or having an opinion on it, or being an influencer on this kind of behavior. So I think there's something similar, but I believe given the fact that it's an emerging space where the jury in that sense is not yet out, I think the platforms are doing a good job by reminding people. Then it's also people to how they take it. Now I'll come to the fake news part. Now fake news, that is very serious, and I'll also this one also I start in the reverse manner. So a few days back, there was this funny news of one media company, and I'll not name them, put out a news saying that our veteran actors who had passed away, and how 2020 is such a bad year. Look at the coincidence. These two gentlemen, these are their ages. Now, if you add the age to their year of birth, you arrive at 2020, and it's serious. It was put out as news. Now, another arm of the same media company does a fact check on this. Now, it can be interpreted in several ways. First, the stupidity of the entire, being a media company being influenced by, such a stupid, kind of, it's a joke. It's actually a joke for somebody to take it seriously. Then, even when they were called out, their editors just didn't get it. And anyway, so it kept on going. And now look at it. Now there is another media entity which fact checks its own news. Now that's the extent to which fake news has happened. So fake news can arise out of ignorance, bad journalistic practices. When in the time that I was in that media education phase, there were some fundamentals of journalism. You had to check your sources, you have to cross-check your sources. There were certain norms in how do you name a source, or if you have to keep your source hidden, can you attribute everything that you put out to some authority? How do you distinguish news from opinion? What are the common pitfalls? So, this is journalism 101. Now, what's happening is media organizations are failing where they are not following this, journalism 101 for various reasons. And I think all of us should know what those reasons are. The challenge is with the common public. So with the common public, I think there is some education that platforms that people consume these, this media, this news, etc. on, and the platform should be playing a lot more educative role. Like they are doing something on the screen time bit, I think they should be playing a lot more proactive role. Because again, I'm talking about people like my father or our respective, fathers, and their ability to cut through, blatant fake news is not that strong. I'll give you another example. It's that, we used to get those emails, the spam emails saying that click here because I've got a fortune waiting for you somewhere, I'm a prince. Now, there are some of us who would see it and know it's fake and spammy. There are some who would fall for it. Even today, we are in 2020. So now you're talking of some 400, 500 million people. And if you look at the global level, a lot more, who are experiencing internet for the first time. So for a lot of them, it would not be, these are, such wisdom comes over time. in the digital space, I think at an overall society level, there is still some distance to go. Therefore, I think the platforms have to play a lot more role in educating people. Roadways buses across towns, they put out beware of pickpockets. Now, if you look at, I'll ask you guys around, if of 100 people look around, how many of you have actually had your pockets picked? It may be some small person, but the road transport guys have figured out over decades of experience that you need to educate people like this. How effective that is, we can debate that, but it is their responsibility to put out that warning to you repeatedly. I believe the software platforms have to play a lot more active role on this.
Yes, sir. That was my exact question only. Ki how do you think that the humane part comes in to these softwares, where Twitter, Instagram, all these things are actually making opinions of people, and they're making sure that people are fed a certain point of line. So that was my question, Ki how can we make sure, like how can companies make sure?
I'll add a very good insight to this one. So again, slightly more relevant to the folks who were using the internet maybe 20 years back. And over the last decade also. So in the internet, we had this problem called viruses. If you're using a PC, somebody would send you some file exe and you clicked on it and your computer was infected. And a lot of these viruses would spread through 2-3 common processes. The most common one was through email. That somebody sends you an attachment, somebody inadvertently forwards your attachment. The attachment kind of triggers off a series of emails to everybody in your contact books. Everybody gets infected, and an email with that virus attachment. Now, what email companies over the years started doing was that instead of leaving the onus on me as a PC user to install an antivirus on my computer, so that if a virus comes, my computer knows that there's so I've got that bit of security built in. The email companies started doing that they started doing email scans even at their server level. So even before I opened my email, the email companies have done that bit of scanning, so that I, as a absolute layman user, I'm not put in that risk. So even during the my IBEBO years, we actually got an email product. A part of running that business was that I had to engage with one of the best global antivirus systems. And they used to be very expensive, but it was incumbent that we had to use that because it was your responsibility towards your users. So why I'm sharing that example is that this is how it was being solved in that era. I genuinely believe there is at least some level of filtering, which can be done by technology, should be done by platforms. The software nuance part, I believe there has to be some bit of editorial reskilling, retooling that platforms need to do. I think what the fact checker companies are doing globally, it's a great job. 5 years ago, who would have thought that India itself would have about a dozen odd fact checking companies? So somewhere I believe the platforms need to have a mix of automated systems like the email, like the email companies are doing. They need to have the next level of editorial teams who are actually constantly making and re-evaluating these algorithms with live inputs. And last but not the least, they need to have somebody to be sitting in, somebody like an ombudsman or somebody who's a final authority on, who is the torch holder for the rest of the organization. Because the rest of the organization is huge, is located in multiple processes. Half the organization will actually be working behind an algorithm. So there has to be some of these visor guys, these master shifus in this organization, whose job is to help the rest of the platform companies tackle this. So it's a three-way combination is how I'll put it right now.
Okay, sir. Thank you. The next question we have is from Chevi Nolakha. She's asking if you look at the post-COVID-19 world, OTT platforms have recently taken an interesting turn. How do you see the future of OTT platforms in India?
Hey, Chevi. So I'll put it. I will not dispute your first part that in the way the world has shaped Corona and post-COVID. OTT, and again, I hate using the word OTT. I know we have to use it, but OTT as a problem, it means over the top. Over the top means something which has in literature, it has a slightly not so pleasant
negative
connotation. So I mean, but I'm just kind of making it a point of I know we use it in the industry a lot. So digital distribution platforms is the term that I would rather use. So they had a role which was already increasing. It was a matter of time before it would kind of obliterate and overtake all the media platforms. I've been saying it for many years. And I know there's a term that started in the last 3-4 years, which was cut the cord. Cut the cord means that you cut the cable connection that you have at home, and which is also strange because a lot of the half of India had already moved to satellite TVs. But that's okay. I mean, the point is that I think that movement was already happening. I think now it has been accelerated by this. There are generations, my children's generation. They do not know what linear or what broadcast TV model is. Their TV model is on demand. You scroll through genres, you scroll through apps within that. So when they go to their grandparents' places, they have some difficulty in understanding, and they'll tell you, put this program on, and then you say, no, but I can't because that program comes at 8 p.m. So they don't have that concept. So there's an entire generation which is coming up like that. Of course, there's the older generation who decides, that, this is what is good, I want to do that. There's a generation who knows this is the only way. So I think that was inevitable, but you are right. It is something because of, the way a lot of people's interactions are going to happen online only, whether it is video consumption, whether it is video interaction, the way we are happening, or music consumption. I'll tell you another one small nugget I just reminded of. So we were at IIM Indore from 1998 to 2000. This is exactly the time that the internet was taking off in the globe, and 2000 was the year of the .com bust. So of the various case studies that we studied at IIM Indore, one was about you studied Porter framework, those 5 forces. One of them is about set of competitive forces. So in that internet class, somebody mentioned that in one of those classes, somebody mentioned that the internet is a threat to the travel industry. And we said, yeah, theoretically it's fine, but too much of a stretch. It ain't going to happen. There is no substitute to traveling. Lo and behold, 2020, and that's what is happening. Yes, it may be forced, but it is a substitute. It has turned out to be a substitute. So, I mean, it has happened in my lifetime itself, that from a situation where I'm in a discussion where it sounds like a nice academic concept to where it's actually in practice globally. Yes, so the digital life is going to become more and more kind of involved, and not only OTT, education. I mean, a lot of us would have, personal examples at home of how folks are, how kids are reacting, how those of us who are into teaching, how you are taking over the role, how you are managing your corporate discussions. And a lot of it is working. So everything is not a sorry discussion. Some of these discussions are good as well.
Thank you. So we've got multiple sort of questions with the same thing. I'll ask one. Sure. From Renuka Ji, hi Rahul, from your experience of building internet products, how close is the product at the time of the launch compared to idea with which you start? Do you do A/B testing or any such before a full-fledged launch, or iterate along the way? And how should a startup on a limited budget go about prioritizing development, functional features versus aesthetics?
Fair. Hi Renuka, great question. And I'll tell you, because I've seen it from both challenges where, working in a small startup with constraints on resources, how you tackle it versus working in a bigger corporate, bigger companies where the resources are not so much of an issue as a certain adherence to some processes. So I've seen it from both prisms. And so your first part of the question was, how different do products turn out to be from when they are being ideated to when they launch? I think different products have different ranges, but there are examples of products being very different from what they started out to what they became, and certain products being exactly as they were envisaged and them being launched. So there is, I think, there are both which are valid. So there is no correct answer, but both do happen. Second point was also about this point about and not specifically you asked this, but I just want to add this. It's also about how much is user research useful in creating new products. It's very famous, I think it's been done to death, this cliche of that if Steve Jobs had asked people in 2006, what is the kind of phone that you want? So people's frame of reference would have been Nokia phones that they were using at that point in time, and one would have thought of, add more pixels, do something, etc. Users could not have thought of an iPhone. Similarly, when you're talking of, go back 100 years back, and when the automobiles were coming in, the first set of automobiles, and if you were to ask people, how would you want your riding experience to be better, what would have people said? Hey, add 2 more horses to my cart, or make my wheels more oily, etc., or add some kind of shockers to my cart. But people who were used to riding in horse carriages could not have thought of, what if the entire thing was driven by a piston or an engine. So sometimes you pick up users' insights and think of what is the solution. So this is where, I'll go back to the early point that I mentioned about form follows function follows purpose. So function is about traveling. I'm going from point A to point B. Purpose could be about, do I need to go there very fast to deliver something? Do I need to go, to meet a prospective client, in which case I need to be presentable, in which case I need to have a certain travel experience. So somewhere that helps, that could help in arriving at an answer without having to do a research. Research helps, but I don't believe research is going to come up with breakthrough products, because what is the value that you are adding if the user is able to tell? Because user can only tell so much as, he's able to articulate his own experiences and his own expectations. It's for you to pick up and, do a leap. The third point was about A/B testing also. So yes, I also believe, I think the way I have seen, and it's in my experience, of course, I'm sure many of you would have, varied experiences with varied degrees of, success or failures. So A/B testing actually has worked better for features, not for the entire range of products. So product is more like a call that you've taken in terms of what is my relationship with a user, an end user, and what is that I'm doing to his, his sense of self, his mind, his brain area, etc. Remember that spectrum from user pain to user delight. Where is it that I'm making an intervention? That could vary, but features, yes, A/B testing helps. But beyond a point, I would also say it's not always feasible. Not all. Some features lend themselves very well to A/B testing. Emailers, for example, I'll share with you, where the objective of an emailer is, in most cases, is to get a click through. That a person should read an email, click an email, and land up on the desired call to action that you've laid out for him. Now, even before he opens the email, it's about, is he going to open the email at all? Which is where, the headline comes in, the title of the email. Now, some of it over the years internalized. So some people are smart editors, they know what works. Some people learn what others are doing. Some people fall into traps, which is where clickbaits come in, hurry now, do this, open up and it'll blow your mind. But this way, I think A/B testing helps for something as small as this, because you will send out emails only once, and you want it to have a certain ROI. So yes, so some features, I continue to believe it works. Did I miss any part of the question, Dani?
No, sir. Sir, just for the benefit of time, I'll ask two more questions.
Sure, please.
One is from Tarun Minocha. He's asking, as digital experiences are moving towards data-driven user experiences, how are you going to leverage analytics to drive product experience across all the products that you've managed?
Hi. Hey, Tarun. I think I'll pick this one up and I'll kind of abut it to the previous question also. So analytics, I think, is so for somebody who's been an involved product creator, whether from, a product management side, marketing side, development side, testing side, somebody whose job is ops, 24 hours, you want to see the product up. I think analytics over the years has become the, the oxygen that keeps us going. You mentioned screen time, the platforms taking, advising people to, reduce their screen time or become more judicious in screen time. I believe companies need to do this to their passionate, product folks, that stop looking at your analytics, because the good companies are obsessed about analytics. So you want to check every minute what's happening. Hey, 11 more orders have come, which could very well mean, hey, 10,000 more people opened up the page today. Hey, the campaign that we ran, this is what it's doing. So I think it's a given. It's not a choice. It is a part of the core, skill sets or a part of your functional, the way you set up your organization, howsoever small. The analytics is a given. Now, but there's a part to it. So that it becomes useful rather than, making you a prisoner of checking your stats every half an hour, is from time to time, it's about why are you chasing certain analytics. So, for example, in the internet base, a lot of games we used to have it a lot. Of course, in most internet products, that's important. It was about DAU, MAU, DAU being daily active users, MAU being monthly active users. Then the parts that added to this are daily users divided by multiple MAU. So DAU by MAU, which was a ratio of how many people who you got this month are actually opening up a product on a daily basis also. Because people may come to you on a monthly basis, but find no utility daily, and then they kind of churn out. So having 100,000 users, or I'll take a very simple example, 30 days, every day you get 1,000 new users. So at the end of the month, you're going to be showing 30,000 monthly active users. But you know what happened? Every one of these 1,000 users did not come the next day. So you had a product which had 30,000 monthly active users, but only 1,000 DAU. Now, in this kind of case, there is your MAU is of no use at all. So therefore, companies and product types have to figure out what is the correct analytics and to what purpose. Now, for a product that is involved in a monthly activity, I think it's absolutely fine. If the usage is going to happen only once in a month, if it's a product type which is around, maybe recharges or maybe travel, holiday travel, which again is a category, not so hot right now. But by way of insights, those are product categories which you're not going to be using every day. On the other hand, if you're going to be buying groceries, it is going to happen every day. So you got to figure out how you're going to be using your analytics to what objective. And if that objective, from time to time, you take a call on what are my big goals, how is this contributing, how is this kind of adding up to my, bigger purpose, bigger business direction, and arrive at a, okay. I'll summarize the answer by saying that keep relooking. Do not become prisoners to analytics. But obsession in analytics is important as well.
Okay, thank you, sir. We've got two people who are asking questions about higher education and education right now. One is from Raj Aryan and the other is from Harshad Sachani. So they're basically asking about how can gaming change the way things are taught to people? And in a post-COVID-19 world, do you think that higher education, since it has been impacted a lot, can there be some sort of a disruption in this industry where higher education teaching methodology is changed?
The first one, Raj Aryan from Mohabbatein. Hi, Raj. Hi, Harshal. Thanks a lot for the question. I think, again, these are two questions which are not necessarily kind of stemming from each other, but both of them kind of stand relevant next to each other. The first was about how gaming. So I'll put it the other way around. Actually, of course, there is a certain way in which the world perceives gaming. I've also seen the reverse, which is about what are the insights that gaming picks up from the world. And in fact, as I mentioned, I was a very late starter in economics, but of the things that I started, understanding and the guys who kind of made an impression upon me, one of them was about how economics is all about a system of rewards and, incentives and penalties. That is actually a game. So if you look at economy itself and, how we expect people to behave in economies is actually a game. There are incentives that you put on the reward. There are challenges that people have, and you want them to cross certain thresholds. In which case, you start, rewarding. You start giving them rewards. So that remains. I think over the year, there are slightly more evolved disciplines have evolved around gamification as a specific, discipline. I believe that discipline continues to evolve at a very very rapid pace, because the platforms on which you deployed those themselves are evolving at a very rapid pace. And that's where I'll bring in the COVID-19 example. Now, you're having a video discussion, and okay, I'll bring in an older insight that I have. So during my Vivo Games, one of the killer insights that we had, and we were working with a couple of one of the biggest companies in the world in terms of. So if you're playing a real-time, a Teen Patti or some kind of a game with people, it would be great if you could look at the people as well. And I'm talking this around year 2010-11. We are in 2020. The exact opposite is happening. Now, people are getting into conflict. People have figured out, because of COVID, people's emotional, emotional wires have been kind of reignited, that people are wanting to reach out to their schoolmates. IIM Indore is organizing, these webinars with their, alumni community. And so the solutions existed even yesterday. So the same solution that we are using right now were available 1 year and 3 years ago and 5 years ago also, or maybe slightly less, but 5 years ago also. So one is the enabling environment, which is about devices, and of course, and the connectivity, which I think Jio is, of course, as I mentioned, has completely transformed it. Think of COVID-19 in a non-Jio environment, and the world would look so different. Now, coming to the last part, it's about today, everybody is doing video conferences, and now gaming companies are putting games on top of video. So the platform is a video platform, and games are put on top of that. In 2010, we were working on games as a platform and video being put out as a solution on top. So therefore, I mentioned things will keep evolving. Gamification will need to keep evolving along the platforms. You mentioned higher education. Now, that's a tough one, and I may not be the best person to answer that. I mean, in totality.
I think
yeah.
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please clarify.
I think I just wanted to clarify that they're talking about how can we create an empathetic product in an education industry.
Yes. Okay. Great. Good. So I think that is a very valid question, because it's maybe if you now start drawing the graph, the empathy needs to be towards two sets of users. No, three. In fact, let me make that three. There are students. Now, students below a certain age, you add the second set of users, which are parents. So this is user category 1, students, user category 2, which is parents, and there's a user category 3, which is teachers. Since everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people kind of have gotten hustled into it, given the circumstances, there's been a lot of struggle has happened in this one. So here is a very small anecdote I'll share, and I'm sure this will echo with a lot of you, and some of you would have even more deeper insights in this. So for me, and this is something I tweeted about, I've got children who are aged 4 and 7. School is over, but the school says, hey, let's have an online class, so-and-so, 9 a.m. So when kids normally get ready for school every day at 7 a.m., you had worked out a workflow, how you would get them ready, send them to school, etc. Now, here comes a time, 9 a.m. You wake them, they're ready and all, and now you could tell them to sit in front of a computer screen. Imagine, try to get a 4-year-old to sit in front of a computer screen. I mean, I'm sure all of us have different kind of challenge. If it were a game, they'll sit for 2 hours. Show them a video and they'll sit for 2 hours. Tell them it's a class. Apart from the novelty of, seeing faces, it's difficult to get them to focus. A 7-year-old kid or a 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid has figured out. They have a certain way. There's a certain amount of, way that they have. So there is a certain kind of empathy that you need to hold the attention of a 4-year-old. There's a certain kind of empathy that you need to hold the attention of 7-year-old to maybe 15 to 20-year-olds. The way video solutions work, only the person who speaks, his face is visible, or his face comes in focus. A class has 20 or maybe 30 people. How do you show all 30 people? So teachers evolve this thing about, okay, if you understood what I've said, say yes. Normally this in class. Out there, just give me a thumbs up. Because if you unmute a class of 30 young kids, you're in for disaster. Now, that entire act of muting and unmuting an entire class, the teachers forget, poor teachers. I mean, so this is my third part of the empathy. The third set of users, teachers. I mean, they were all awesome teachers in classrooms. They had a certain methodology worked out in terms of, giving in-class lectures, checking assignments, giving back feedback, counseling students. All that is changed into this window that they have to interact to 30 students in one go with. So yes, there is empathy that needs to be shown on all three sides. So we give a lot of feedback. I and my wife give a lot of feedback to our, students' school, our kids' schools, and I think they were very understanding because we were understanding of their challenges as well, and how they're going to figure out what. And then I think to make the job easier for the people who are devising these platforms. And there's another layer on top of this. So let me take a very simple example just to sum this one up. There's YouTube. So YouTube's job is to create the software solutions, the platform solutions. Then there's the entire category of people called YouTube creators. Think about this. Every guy who you see on YouTube and he wants you to follow, he says, "Acha, video dekh liya, uske baad bell icon pe zarur dabaye." Now look at what has happened. Whenever a YouTube content creator tells you to click on a bell icon, the YouTube software solution platform has actually failed. Or there's a deficiency in the platform that this guy has to kind of, overcompensate for. Now, something like that is happening in the education, but I believe it's early days. I think they can learn a lot by way of who are they solving the problem for and to what effect. But I think a lot of, they've kind of arrived, they've got a good starting point. But yes, if they think for all these three user categories and, if you're teaching dance on, there's the same student who was sitting in front of a screen and you were telling him, don't move, keep a plain background. Now you tell him, okay, you know what, move everything out, move 6 feet away because we got to practice dancing. Things change. So somewhere I think teachers are like the YouTube creators in this equivalent in the system. The platform that people are using are more like, YouTube kind of platform. Children are both the audience as well as, they are participants in the discussion as well. Yeah.
Okay, last question. This is from Altamash Aslam. I think you've mentioned this, and he is saying, ki, "Hi Rahul, pleasure to have interacted with you multiple times. Just wanted to know what is your view on the next digitization wave in terms of services and products due to COVID." I think you've touched a little on this.
Yes, I think the last two I'll mention this one,
and
the last two also are. So one is of course on the entertainment products, the interactive education. Education of course has got this. The next one to be, I think health is extremely important. It's something that without COVID also, I think the overall impact that remote healthcare, remote driven or remote influence healthcare was going to have, I think was profound. I think post-COVID becomes a lot more important. I mean, it's kind of been fast-tracked in a very big way, but that was in any case going to be a really big education. We are agreeing to has been kind of driven into it. It was going to happen, but it's been driven into it, and there's a lot more that can be unlocked and will be unlocked. The other is on the health side. I think it's that's the other category of digital experiences where I believe a lot will change. Would have changed, but will definitely change now.
Okay, thank you, sir. The others who've got questions, we'll try to get all those questions to sir and see if he'll be able to respond to them. And thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I'd like to thank the entire Delhi team, Alok sir, Nikun sir, Vikash sir, Pranav sir, Vidit, Yash, and specifically Soham Bal for helping us out with the technical aspects of this webinar. And thank you so much, sir, for joining all of us.
So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who's patient enough to listen to what was essentially unstructured discussions from an old alumni. Second, I think also big thanks to the team. I think they've been persevering. I think this is a very important initiative. We need to do a lot more of this. Since I see it from perspective of where we were in 1998, 2000 to where we are right now, I think we've really come up a long way. And I think initiatives like this are going to play a very important role, in us being unlocking a lot more, network and community value of the IIM community. And you mentioned all the, organizers. Thank you to all of them. And of course, Gagi, since the protocol is that you would not name yourself, but thank you to you also for helping kind of put this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Before we kind of log off for today's, I'd like to thank again Rahul to join us today. Important announcement to everyone who's there on the call. We have a webinar scheduled tomorrow by the Tamil Nadu chapter. It's by Captain J.V. Avidhanalu from IIT Kharagpur alumnus, and he's also the visiting faculty. So do join us tomorrow as well, 6:30. And once again, I'd like to thank Rahul for joining us. Although you have kind of avoided the topic of not sharing, not kind of going through your experiences and sharing your journey of your lifetime, rather wanted to cover. But throughout this webinar, I feel that we have covered your experiences through emphatic product design and services. So a round of applause to you also, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, sir.